Good evening. I'm Chris Matthews in Washington. Let me start tonight with this. Colin Powell, perhaps the most respected Republican in the country, says his party is sending a message to African Americans. By pushing measures that make it harder for people to vote, it's saying that it wants to punish black America. That's Colin Powell speaking. This puts General Powell, the hero of the Gulf War, in a battle with RNC Chair Reince Priebus, who has presided over the Republican Party's multi-state effort to close down voting days and set higher requirements for voting in this country. So who are you going to call? The general who wants to get Americans, all Americans, to vote and participate in this country's government? Well, or the party chair who supports bills to make it harder for minorities and young people to vote? Who are you going to call? Colin Powell, war hero, or Reince Priebus, the field marshal of the Republican program to vastly reduce the number of black voters? James Peterson is the director of Africana Studies at Lehigh. He's an engineer. And Clarence Page is a columnist for the Chicago Tribune. Let's start with General Powell and what he said in his own words today. He was speaking at North Carolina at the CEO Forum down there in Raleigh, where he criticized Republican efforts to limit voting. The News and Observer down there quotes him as saying, quote, "I want to see policies that encourage every American to vote, not make it more difficult to vote." It immediately turns off a voting bloc the Republican Party needs. These kinds of actions do not build on the base. It just turns people away. You can say what you like, but there is no voter fraud. How can it be widespread and undetected? What it really says to the minority voter is, we really are sort of punishing you. Clarence Page, you've been covering politics as long as I have. Colin Powell only comes in from Olympus or wherever he reigns from occasionally, and everybody hears every word he speaks because he is a Republican.
Well, he is, and it wasn't that long ago, back in the mid-'90s, you remember, when people, not just Republicans, were pushing him to run for president, which is a reflection of the kind of the level of credibility he has. But, you know, Chris, I've often thought that, Powell was in the military for the second half of the last century. It's almost like being encased in ice while all these crazy changes have happened in the Republican Party. It's moved farther right. He still represents what's left of the old Rockefeller Republicans, the Eisenhower Republicans, the Jake Javits Republicans. That's his sensibility.
The Lionel Hampton Republicans,
if you will. Thank you.
No, he was one of the chair of the parties up in New York.
Really, that's his sensibility.
With Dina Merrill. There was an interesting duo.
That's right.
But actually, you're right. I don't want to be too comical about it because that's the Republican Party I grew up watching and my family was part of. And
that's right.
Let me go to James Peterson. This professor. This thing is a battle writ large, I think, because there you have now the most respected Republican across party lines, and you have Reince Priebus, who has a job. He's a partisan. Somehow he got the idea with this 30-some state effort to reduce the chance of a black voter that the way that a diminishing white percentage of the country, a diminishing Republican portion of the country, will survive is to make it harder for the other portion of the country, the growing portion, to participate. It's pretty blatant, especially we're going to have some quotes coming up on this segment of Republicans saying that's what they're up to.
You're right. It's blatant, and it's quite cynical. It's kind of a last-ditch effort to play to that shrinking base of the Republican Party that we've been talking about a lot since the presidential election. Chris, you're right about General Powell's sort of measuredness in terms of when and how he makes interventions, and part of the reason why he's able to retain some of his credibility is because he does it so rarely. And so when he does it, we want to hear what he has to say. He's been challenging his party. Every time he's made any of these interventions within the Obama era, he's been challenging his party to be more reasonable, and I think that's the kind of the pathway to the future. Unfortunately, Reince Priebus is in a tough situation where the candidates and the politicals within his party that want to have a certain kind of campaign sort of stretch into the midterms and ultimately into the presidential election are very much interested in continuing to play to this base. Not everyone in the Republican Party is trying to do this, but Reince Priebus is following the lead of the Ted Cruz wing of the party right now.
You're right. And let me tell you, you're sitting in Philadelphia with the cityscape behind you there. And I got to tell you, it reminded me that I grew up in a state, Pennsylvania, where you're at, you're a professor at, up in Lehigh, where you had Hugh Scott for senator for years. You had Arlen Specter, senator for years, both Republicans. And Arlen would get like 35% of the African-American vote, a huge chunk, which is the historic percentage the Republican Party used to get before it started to get 10% of the black vote, which is why it loses an 80% of the a net 80% of the black vote in the big cities, because 90 minus 10 is 80. It used to be 2/3 minus a third was a third. And a Republican Party could win statewide easily by losing a third of the black vote net. But when you start losing a net 80% of the black vote, you're not in the business anymore. Anyway, here's Pennsylvania Republicans, a guy speaking out openly about using voter ID requirements to limit the vote. Here's Pennsylvania House Republican leader Mike Turzai in June of last year. Let's listen to him admit they're using this voter ID requirement to screw the black voter out of voting. Let's listen to him.
Voter ID, which is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania. Done.
Romney wins with the voter ID card. And just this summer, the Pennsylvania Republican Party chair bragged that voter ID helped Republicans shave some points. This is like point shaving in basketball. Shaved some points from Obama's win last year. Let's listen to this guy admit it again. We're not making this up.
Do you think all the attention drawn to voter ID affected last year's elections?
Yeah, I think a little bit. I think we probably had a better election. Think about this. We cut Obama by 5%, which was big. You know, a lot of people lost sight of that. He won. He beat McCain by 10%, and he beat Romney by 5%. I think that probably voter ID had helped a bit in that.
What's this guy under sodium pentothal? I mean, why are they, Professor? I'm going to go to Clarence. I don't get it. I don't know why they even admit it. They just what world do they live in?
Some people are kind of tone deaf to how they sound. You know, I mean, here his party is denying that voter ID has anything to do with race or partisanship, when everybody knows quite the opposite. He just gave the game away. Kind of like when Lee Atwater said, "Well, we don't use the N-word anymore. Now we're more abstract. You know, use words like school busing or crime in the streets, blah blah blah." That's the same kind of thing happening here.
But he said here, and Professor, he's saying the mere word spreading in the black community, where people live in row houses and don't all have driver's licenses, and people get old and live into their 70s and 80s and maybe 90s if they're fortunate. They're not driving around in cars. They don't have driver's licenses. And they get the word because of the Republican effort out there. Hey, there's this new requirement. You don't have the right paperwork. A lot of people, apparently, according to this guy, 5% didn't bother voting because they thought they weren't allowed to. So they won just by the bad noise.
I know, but it's, you know, it's absurd though, Chris, because what the data really shows is that actually this tactic backfired at the presidential level because it galvanized voters and it charged voters up to wait longer and kind of sort of pursue through it. But it's also, this is really interesting. Why aren't they talking about voter fraud, which is supposed to be the reason behind this? They're talking about shaving points and trying to sort of reduce and diminish the vote. We live in a democracy. Either we're trying to make this a greater democracy where more people participate, or we're not. And so if you're putting in laws and you're instituting and supporting laws that are against this. And listen, this is not just against the black vote. This is against elderly voters, as you just pointed out. This is against Latino, Hispanic voters. This is against college students. ID laws and sort of shrinking the window to vote basically reduces our democracy to less than what it can be right now, and this is why it's intolerable.
Yeah, I think, and Colin Powell, the general's so smart because he's not denying there's any voter fraud. Of course there's voter fraud. Things happen. There's some big city machines we grew up with. We know, I'm not sure it happens in Chicago, but it has a place like Philly over the years. But it doesn't change the results of statewide elections or big congressional elections or anything like that. And if there, and as Powell points out, the great irony, it's a bit sarcastic, if there's so much of it that affects elections, how come nobody can find any?
Right.
And that's a good point. Anyway, there's even more movement today in the voting rights effort. In addition to General Powell's comments, the Justice Department filed a lawsuit against the state of Texas to block that state's voter ID law, which went into effect a mere hours after the Supreme Court decision that effectively gutted the Civil Rights Act, actually the Voting Rights Act. In a statement here, the Attorney General Eric Holder said, "We will not allow the Supreme Court's recent decision to be interpreted as open season for states to pursue measures that suppress voting rights." In fact, within hours of that comment, Senator John Cornyn of Texas, who is one partisan pal, issued his own statement, which reads, in fact, "Facts mean little to a politicized Justice Department bent on inserting itself into the sovereign affairs of Texas and a lame duck administration in trying to turn our state blue." Excuse me, Senator. Lame duck. We are 6 months into a 4-year presidential term.
Right.
But that's the way they want us to think. Isn't it, Clarence?
Well, you know,
they've been pretty good at it. Make everybody think Obama's on his way out the door.
Sure. You know, the irony of this is that, as was mentioned earlier, while the Republicans have put so much attention on voter ID, they have a problem getting white, blue-collar male voters to turn out. And that's probably what really sunk Romney. When you look at the turnout among reliable Republican voters in reliable districts, especially rural districts and all. That really made a big difference because Romney was not connecting with the base. And this is why it's
Well, he connected once when he said 47%.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah, yeah.
Hey, everybody in America heard that one.
That apparently had a bigger impact than anything else.
Because a lot of Republicans are below the average income in this country.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
They're called cloth coat Republicans. They're regular. Where my family, regular Republicans are not all rich.
Thank you. We've seen that for the last 50 years. That's where your Reagan Democrats came from. Ronald Reagan connected with blue-collar white voters, but they have not had that kind of connection since in the GOP. And so they turned to tactics like voter ID to try to shave a few points here.
Let's go to the academic world. Tell me, Professor, I don't know you personally. I've only seen you do such great things on this network, especially, and I mean it. But tell me what you say in school to school guys up at Lehigh, and how do they see this in history, in American history, that the Republican Party, after all these years of being damn good back in the 60s on voting rights. I checked it out today. Only 2 Republican senators in the entire Senate voted against the Voting Rights Act. That was John Tower of Texas and, of course, Strom Thurmond. That was it. Every other Republican senator was gung-ho for voting rights, and today, what would the vote be? Among Republicans.
It would be almost the opposite of that. And what I try to tell students, Chris, is we have to be students of history, but also understand this particular moment. It gets really tricky when you think about the history of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party and how they've sort of switched sides. And you look at the Democratic Party, a lot of progressives think that the Democratic Party is kind of the Republican Party of the immediate future. And so there is some confusion. But these particular cases, we have to pay attention. You know, what Attorney General Holder is looking at here is using Section 2, the section of the Voting Rights Act that hasn't been gutted, that actually prohibits any kind of voting practices that discriminate based upon race, color, or what they refer to as linguistic minority. And also the Congress in the 80s added certain addendums to this so that the courts could use all sorts of important information, like to look at the history of a particular state or particular district, to look at racial polarization in terms of voting, to look at representation in terms of elected officials across racial lines. And so we have to share that and teach young people to look at the details around some of these issues. And that's how we sort of wrestle through these kind of complicated times.
Thanks, James. Thank you, Clarence. And by the way, it reminds me, Reince Priebus, that's really his name, by the way. Yeah, quick.
Chris, one more thing. We're not engineers anymore. Lehigh is no longer the engineers. We're the Mountain Hawks now.
Oh, okay. I'll keep up with that. I'll keep up like the Stanford Cardinal with its Christmas tree, a mascot. Anyway, I just want to say this. It's like the little kid who runs home with it and takes his ball home because he can't win the game. Right. It was once the Republican Party's great challenge to compete for the African-American vote. That's right. And they did a decent job for years. They go to get back in the game. Anyway, that's my coach. Get back in the game. Anyway, Republicans. Anyway, a programming note, Rachel Maddow.